Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. My name is Amba Kak, and I co-lead the AI Now Institute. Thank you so much for being here. It's really heartening to see such a packed room on a Monday evening, even more so to think and talk about a subject that at this point is coming out of our ears. Everyone has an AI take right now, and for those of us that have been thinking about this stuff for over a decade now, it's pretty surreal to see it become the subject of dinner table conversation in this country, across the world. And there's a wide spectrum of AI conversations you could be having right now, from the speculative doomsday Terminator variant to the utopic declarations that super intelligent AI will eliminate cancer and poverty, world peace, why not? Or even the somewhat more grounded, but oddly not always less speculative questions about how AI is going to transform work and productivity. Now, what these conversations have in common is that they position society, all of us, as on the receiving end, passive observers to this onward march of technology which itself is almost endowed with this kind of divine agency. It leaves the majority of people, just based on conversations we've been having over the last year, feeling disempowered to challenge, to ask questions, instead feeling rushed and anxious about remaking our lives, adapting our values, our conceptions of the world, so that we won't be left behind. So I really hope that today's event sort of cuts through the din and offers you all a different lens with which to think about AI and the future. Neither alarm nor celebration, but reclaiming public agency in deciding which way we move from here. Not just debating whether ChatGPT is good or not, or how good it is, but whether the AI industry's unaccountable power is good for society. And Karen's book is a really good place to start. It uses the framework of empire and detailed investigative methods to help us get a grasp on these questions. We're here today to celebrate this book, a book that has pierced through the noise, the fact that it has already become an instant New York Times bestseller. Let's give her a round of applause. It really is testament not just to this book, but to Karen's incredible body of work as a journalist. She has unparalleled integrity, and I can tell you that people who otherwise sort of disagree vehemently on all things AI can usually agree that Karen's reporting cuts to the heart of some of the most important issues in our field. Now, before we dig in, I did want to flag that you should all on your seats have a copy of the introduction to AI Now's latest annual report, Artificial Power. It officially launches tomorrow, and it tackles the theme of today's conversation, how the current AI boom grants the tech industry and the tech oligarchs that are running these companies a power that goes well beyond their deep pockets, and the tools that we as members of the public have available to us to hold this power to account and to reshape this trajectory. So please do read it. We would love to hear what you think and for you to share it widely in your networks. We do ask that you do this after tomorrow morning once it's public. So switching gears to the agenda for today, we're going to have a 30-minute panel discussion followed by 15 minutes of open Q&A before we break for a drinks reception and book signing outside. So let's dive into the panel. I'm honored to invite three of the sharpest, most inspiring thinkers on tech to join me. Can I invite Lina Khan, Karen Howe, and Sarah Myers-West on stage? Okay, I'm going to do quick introductions and then hand it over. Lina Khan is currently law professor at Columbia Law School and former chair of the US Federal Trade Commission. Her term was by every account historically significant and transformative. Sarah and I were lucky enough to have the chance to work with her and her incredible FTC team. But we're equally excited to be able to celebrate her academic and journalistic work to which she's now returned, and we can't wait to see what comes next. Karen Howe. As you already know, Karen is the first journalist to ever profile OpenAI, and her new book, Empire of AI, is a New York Times bestseller. She writes for venues like The Atlantic and previously worked as a foreign correspondent at the Wall Street Journal, focused on AI in China. And senior editor at the MIT Tech Review. A lesser-known fact is that Karen started her career as an application engineer at the first startup to spin out of Google X. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Sarah Myers-West, my co-conspirator in all things and co-executive director of AI Now. Sarah is an award-winning researcher and policy expert on the political economy of AI. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Amba, and thanks to Lina and Karen for joining us for this conversation today. We'll have some time for questions at the end, so do please start thinking about them. But for now, let's dive in. I want to start with the theme of AI and empire that is at the heart of this book, and thinking about market power, but also other forms of power that go beyond. We're starting to see the effects of this kind of transformation given the sprawling reach of digital technologies. And in your past work, Karen, this is the theme of your book, and in your past work, Lina, you've also written about needing to think about antitrust and that the accompanying toolkit, not just as touching on economic power, but thinking about other forms of tech power that emanate and what happens when you have so much power vested in corporations. So as two people who have thought a lot about this, how do you conceptualize AI and its relationship to tech power? Do you see continuity from previous forms of big tech power, or is this a moment where we're seeing disruption?
That's a really great question. So maybe I could first touch a little bit on why I call my book Empire of AI and ultimately why I define or use this term empire. So the argument that I make in the book is that I'm not just using this term empire loosely to refer to just the way Silicon Valley always talks about building empires. I'm explicitly trying to make an argument that these companies, these AI companies, OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, are increasingly not just companies. They really are new forms of empire because of what you touched on, that they aren't just accruing market power, they're also gaining a significant amount of political leverage, and they're starting to distort the landscape of political discourse. And there are multiple different characteristics that I talk about in the book for why empires of AI, as I call them, are echoes of empires of old. One of them is that they lay claim to resources that are not their own, but they reinterpret rules to suggest that they are their own. This refers to the data that they scrape from the public domain and pretend was always theirs. And they're even trying to lobby the government to then reinterpret copyright law and intellectual property to be in favor of these companies. It refers to the labor exploitation that happens, and that's not just the exploitation of workers for how these companies ultimately produce their technologies, but also the technology that they are producing. OpenAI's definition of artificial general intelligence is highly autonomous systems that outperform humans in most economically valuable work. So their technology itself is labor exploitative and can have market and political effects. And another feature that is lesser talked about is the fact that empires also consolidate and monopolize knowledge production. So these companies over the last 10 years, because they've become so wealthy and are able to give out such huge compensation packages that can easily cross over $1 million, AI researchers have increasingly shifted from academic environments to corporate environments. And so most of the AI research that is encountered today, which is the fundamental basis for public understanding of how this technology works and ultimately the limitations of the technology, are filtered through the lens of the empire. And the last element that I really think has happened here is that there's always this narrative that there are good empires and evil empires when it's a core part of empire building. And the justification for why the good empire needs to be an empire in the first place and engage in all this resource and labor extraction and exploitation is because they need to be strong to beat back that evil empire. And as I document in the book, OpenAI has always had an evil empire that they've kept their focus on. Initially, it was Google. Increasingly, it's now China. And really, it's actually just a cover for allowing them to continue doing this empire building and distort accrue an enormous amount of wealth and political power. And so we're starting to see the effects of this, especially now in the current political environment where Silicon Valley is just so aligned now with the US government and trying to use the US government to continue building out their empire ambitions. And the US government in turn is trying to use Silicon Valley as a way to build out its American empire ambitions. And ultimately, the people that lose out are everyone else, all average Americans, average workers, and people around the world.
Lina, I'm curious for how you're thinking about this, and in particular, do you see this as a moment of continuity or disruption from previous eras of tech power?
Well, first of all, it's so great to be here, and congratulations to Karen on such a timely and deeply and rigorously reported book. It's really interesting to hear you talk about empire as a framework to look at all of this through, because one of the core insights of the kind of original anti-monopolists was that we needed these laws to check extreme concentrations of economic power because of not just the harm that monopolies could do to our economy, but also the harms that they could ultimately do to our politics and our government and our freedoms. And a recognition that what we most care about is kind of creating the conditions for real freedom for people, we really needed to check the ability of private entities to coerce and abuse with impunity. And so in the same ways that we had our Constitution create checks and balances in our political sphere, the antitrust and anti-monopoly laws were almost seen as a corollary to make sure that we were also going to get those protections in our commercial and our economic sphere, which is where for most people, they experience power in their day-to-day lives most regularly, right? And there was a view that, here we as a country had just overthrown a monarch, and we were not, as a result, going to then be governed by an autocrat of trade. And so I think this insight of the porousness between economic and political power is really deep in kind of anti-monopoly thinking more generally. I think we are seeing some continuity. Obviously, there's some real overlap between the companies that came to monopolize in the Web 2.0 era and the kind of major hyperscalers of today. One through line across the monopoly playbook of the Web 2.0 era was that these were firms that basically came to serve as gatekeepers and really came to control key channels of commerce and communications and the kind of key infrastructure that people came to rely on, and consolidating control over that infrastructure and becoming these gatekeepers through this intermediary role was the primary source of their power. That's nothing new, right? You can go all the way back to the railroads that similarly had kind of come to consolidate power over a key infrastructure. But the fact that this was all happening in the digital age meant that there were just new ways that the self-reinforcing advantages of data really turbocharged a lot of that power. And I think what was so striking when first researching that power was just realizing the extent to which it sat upstream from so much. And even major Fortune 500 companies were subjected to this power. And a single decision by a Google or an Amazon to tweak their algorithm or kind of make a business disappear just could have so many cascading ramifications. And I think it's interesting to think about how consolidated control over AI could play an analogous role for these firms in some terms of, who controls the AI is going to be able to control the shots for huge swaths of society, but also in our commercial and economic realm.
So I want to pick up on a thread that you just touched on, Karen, in talking about empire. There's been this pervasive narrative that has shaped the discourse around AI that I think runs very much in parallel to that good versus bad empire theme. And that's the idea that there is this arms race to define the frontier of AI. You have tracked this discourse, and particularly as it sort of surfaces around there being a U.S.-China arms race for years. So I'm curious if you can unpack for us, what's myth, what's reality? Like, how should we think about the role that this narrative is playing in shaping not just the AI market, but the whole space of possibility around AI?
Yeah, so I think one of the features of this AI arms race, in order to understand why this rhetoric exists, I think we kind of also need to talk a little bit about this concept of artificial general intelligence. So AGI, this term, is a very poorly defined term, but generally the hand-wavy definition is the recreation of human intelligence in computers. And it is a term that refers to something that hasn't happened yet, that the AI research field has long sought to accomplish, and also the AI industry has now pegged many of their endeavors to. And the reason why it's really ill-defined is because there's no scientific consensus around what human intelligence is. So in the decades-long history of AI development, there's been a lot of debate and contentiousness over how this technology should be defined, what it should look like, and ultimately what it should do. But because this concept has become so prevalent in discourse that there is supposedly going to be some supreme digital intelligence that might emerge and suddenly reorder all of society, I think that comes hand in hand with this idea that whoever gets it first is either going to be the builder of utopia or the destroyer of worlds. And so it's really escalated what originally I think was already a bit of a competitive dynamic in the US-China tech race, where in general, there's a lot of rhetoric around the U.S. needs to maintain its technological dominance, but it becomes incredibly existential when you layer on this concept that somehow the first mover is going to get their hands on this technology, and then everything will either humanity goes to heaven or goes to hell, essentially. And to just take a step back, I'm deeply skeptical of AGI. There was this really great New York Times article recently that had the headline, "Why We Will Not Get AGI Anytime Soon." And there was a stat within the article that talked about how 75% of AI researchers who have been in this field for a very, very long time and are not financially conflicted with the industry believe that we're not even close to something that could be called an AGI, or even have techniques that would allow us to get to an AGI. So a lot of this is mythologizing. A lot of this is a way to use a narrative that really escalates the idea that Silicon Valley cannot be checked at all in order to fight this grand race for humanity's future. But what we've seen, the effect of this rhetoric, is that companies have done a really good job of trying to get the US government to increasingly put stricter and stricter export controls on American-made and designed chips to China. And that has been the way that they have tried to constrain China's AI development while also trying to leave their own AI development unconstrained. But under these conditions, what we've seen is that Chinese companies have actually continued to innovate under these constrained conditions and have continued to close the gap in AI progress between the US and China. And so ultimately, this race rhetoric has not actually gotten us, it has, all it's effectively done is continue to narrow the lead between the US and China, as well as continue to allow these companies to exist unchecked and to erode human rights for Americans and around the world.
Lina, I'm curious for your thoughts on that concept of innovation. If you were to step back from the arms race frame, step back from AGI as the goal, I'm curious for how you think about what conditions are needed for the U.S. to be a home for innovation in technology, especially innovation that ultimately serves consumers and workers and the public at large.
I mean, it's absolutely true that these firms were swarming DC and trying to create a real sense of panic and alarm and fear-mongering about, the huge potential for the U.S. to fall behind if we didn't just green light, kind of an anything goes ecosystem for them. And, I think within government, there was a real split opinion about what the right approach was to govern these firms, because I think especially those in the kind of national security world were very, sympathetic to some of the arguments that were being made. I think, and the shorthand for this sometimes is the national champions argument, the idea that, the best way for America to get out ahead is to basically coddle and protect our own monopolies so that they can go fight it out on the global stage against other countries' monopolies. A few things there. First, we also have some historical analogs there. AT&T famously deployed the Department of Defense to kind of make the argument that the Justice Department should not file an antitrust suit because it would, again, imperil the United States globally. I understand Professor Tim Wu is maybe in the audience. He has deeply researched and written about this and kind of debunked historically the national champions myth and how it was actually when the United States doubled down on antitrust and competition that we actually saw waves of innovation. And if you compare that with countries like Japan and others that instead did follow the national champions model, we actually saw some real stagnation. So recommend his work on that. I think also just more generally, this national champions argument assumes this Cold War dynamic where American firms are loyal to America first. And I think we've just seen all sorts of complexities there where these firms are actually deeply enmeshed and reliant, including in places like China. And so I think some of the kind of assumptions embedded in that also are worth questioning. I think the other interesting thing is when I was at the FTC, I would kind of go to Silicon Valley occasionally and sit down with founders and startups and innovators. And they were actually very skeptical of the arguments that the big tech were making because they viewed those as basically a way for them to try to lock out competitors and basically lock in their monopoly. And so they were very clear-eyed about how, this maybe is just a way for them to try to get a green light for their monopolies and not be checked. I think historically we have seen that promoting competition is actually really key, not just for innovation, but also for kind of making sure we're not having outsized dependence on a single firm. It's really interesting because some of this, framing and rhetoric around the kind of U.S. versus China ends up being very derisive about the Chinese model and how it's, so centrally planned, unless our American system. When we become so reliant on a handful of monopolies and let them call the shots, that is just another form of centralized planning. And so I think we see some of those same risks there.
Right. And in many ways, this has exactly been the Silicon Valley business strategy. It's to build monopolies or unicorns and to sort of create these chokeholds at different points in the tech stack across data, compute, chips. I want to turn to talk a little bit more about OpenAI. And Karen, for you, you talked a little bit about artificial general intelligence as a more sort of like a concept that's infused a lot of the public discourse. How has it shaped the behavior of OpenAI specifically?
Yeah, so one of the things that I was most surprised by in reporting my book was I really thought that in the public, we hear about these two extreme narratives. AI is going to bring utopia or AI is going to kill humanity. In Silicon Valley, they say specifically AGI is going to bring utopia or AGI is going to kill humanity. The thing that surprised me the most was I thought this was just rhetoric because it's a really convenient way to just conclude the same thing. Both narratives lead to the same conclusion, which is this technology is so supremely powerful that we need it to be controlled by just a small handful of people. And it just so happens that those people are the ones that are telling you that story. What shocked me was that actually there are people who genuinely believe this as a quasi-religious belief. And I say quasi-religious, but honestly, it could just be full-blown religious. They explicitly talk about it as a belief that AGI is here, it's coming, it's right around the corner, and it'll have civilizational transformation either in the positive or the negative direction. And I was talking with people who I call in Silicon Valley, it's called the boomers and the doomers, the people who think utopia versus destroy humanity. And when I was talking with self-identified boomers, like their eyes were wide with wonder, talking about the profound prosperity that everyone would experience, and they were like, how can I not work on this? This is my calling. This was what I was brought to the earth to do. And then I would talk to doomers who their voices were quivering, talking about the possibility of absolute devastation of humanity, everyone, them and their loved ones all dying. Like these were real visceral reactions and real beliefs that you cannot, like when you try to debate them and argue with them, you really do feel like you're debating someone on their religious belief, because there isn't really evidence that you can point to one way or another. It's just a really deep-seated spiritual feeling. And within the history of OpenAI, because OpenAI very, very early on in its history just claimed we are going to develop artificial general intelligence at a time when that was not in vogue, and most scientists were deeply skeptical of anyone that used that terminology, it attracted both boomers and doomers because they were both sects of the same AGI religion. And so the history of OpenAI, there's like just constant clashing between these two very deeply religious factions wrestling over, wait, is it the boomers or the doomers that should have control of this technology? And ultimately, the most spectacular clash was when Sam Altman was fired and then rehired in 5 days. There were also other elements to the clash that weren't just the ideological aspect of it, but this is the thing that is driving so much of AI development today. And one of the reasons why OpenAI chose to build what ultimately turned into ChatGPT and went after this scale at all costs approach to model development was specifically because of these religious beliefs. The boomers wanted to accelerate this technology as quickly as possible to get to utopia as quickly as possible. And the fastest way that they could see doing that was by taking techniques that were already available and just pumping historic levels of data and computational power into those techniques. And the doomers came to the same conclusion: we need to scale this and accelerate AI as fast as possible, because we, the good empire, need to then contain the technology and use our lead time to figure out how to introduce it more safely into the world before the evil empire. And so then both of those forces ultimately led to a massive, massive acceleration in AI and the current kind of race dynamics that we see today.
One of the great things I think about the book, Karen, is that you don't sort of just take the word of engineers as gospel. But you actually went out and you saw the material effects of this technology on people in disparate parts of the world. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that journey. Where did it take you and what did you find?
Yeah, one of the promises that I made to myself when I started this book was I did not want to write a corporate book that just stayed in Silicon Valley, because I do not think that ultimately serves the reader and ultimately serves the public in understanding how this technology is being developed and how it will have huge effects on society. Because the people in the center of power, they're designing this technology in a way that is of their image, of their values, and very aligned with how they live and work and their worldviews and their experience. But you really see the technology fall apart when you travel to much further reaches of the empire and get to the vulnerable communities where they're living in a fundamentally different way from the assumptions or imaginations of people in Silicon Valley. And so I ended up spending time in Kenya, in Chile, in Uruguay, and drawing upon reporting that I did in Colombia and in South Africa to really try and paint a picture of all of the different harms, communities that get harmed by a particular vision of AI progress. And I put progress in quotes because I really do think that there needs to be a broader discussion publicly about how we define progress to automatically assume advancements, technical advancements, and not social progress. But workers, I was speaking with workers who had been contracted by OpenAI in Kenya to develop a content moderation filter. And one of the things I tried to do in the book is I would write about what was happening within the company and the decisions and discussions that they were having in that moment, and how that then had ripple effects to communities around the world. So within OpenAI, during that particular moment, they were transitioning from a research organization to a more commercially oriented organization. And they were thinking about, we have this text generation tool, this text generation model, and we're about to put it in the hands of millions of users. It would be really bad if it started spewing a lot of toxic, racist, abusive speech. That could be a huge PR scandal. In fact, it was for Microsoft in 2016 when they released the infamous Tay chatbot. And so they thought, we need to create some kind of wrapper around this technology that ultimately prevents users from being exposed to this automated BSing of the model. And so they hired these Kenyan workers to develop this content moderation filter. And what that meant was these workers, day in and day out, had to go comb through reams of the worst text on the internet and AI-generated text, where OpenAI was prompting models to imagine the worst text on the internet. And then they were categorizing them into these detailed taxonomies. Is this violent content? Is this sexual content? Is this extremely graphic violent content? Is this sexual content that involves abuse? And does that abuse involve children? And just like in the era of social media, these content moderators were deeply traumatized by the work. And not only did it affect them individually, it affected their families and their communities. So I talk about a man, Mofat Okinye, who was one of the Kenyan workers that OpenAI contracted for a few bucks an hour. And as he started to withdraw more and more within himself, as he was being exposed to these relentless torrents of content, he couldn't explain to his wife or his stepdaughter, her daughter from a previous relationship, what was going on, because he didn't know how to say to them, I do a job where I read sex content all day. ChatGPT hadn't come out yet. It wasn't like a concept at all. And one day, his wife texts him, I would like fish for dinner. And he goes out and buys 3 fish, one for him, one for her, one for the stepdaughter. And when he comes back home, they've packed up their bags and completely left. And she says, I don't know the man you've become anymore, and I do not ever want to come back. And so I tried to document all of these stories and center the people who are really at the bottom of the far reaches of empire, to show ultimately that logic of empire. Like, empire is built philosophically on this belief that there is a hierarchy, a natural hierarchy in the world. There are people who are superior, that are, either God-given or nature-given rights to that, where they deserve to rule over people that are inferior. And this man contributed to OpenAI's development of technology as much as the AI researchers in the center of power, who are being paid over $1 million compensation packages. So why is it that he is completely destroyed, his family's destroyed, his community's destroyed, and he's left with just a couple dollars an hour to show for it? It's just an ideological one, that this is the way the world should work and should be. And so there are many different stories that I highlight in that way. And one of the things that I realized as I finished concluding reporting the book is that no matter which community I spoke to and which harm they experienced, whether it was their intellectual property being taken, like artists telling me about that, or it was Chilean water activists telling them about their fresh water resources being taken, all of them were ultimately saying the same thing, which is, when this initially happened, they had such a sense of loss of agency over their ability to self-determine their future. And so the empire argument comes full circle. Like, in the age of empire, democracy can't exist because the majority of people in the world do not feel like they have any control over their data, over their privacy, over their economic opportunity, over even their life-sustaining fresh water resources, over their land, all of these things. And ultimately, democracy is based on the beautiful philosophy that we do have a right to this. We do need to, we can have agency, we can have control, and we can go to the voting booth and actually have it make a difference. And so if everyone starts feeling that same sense of loss, then it cannot be sustained.
So I want to continue on this theme of thinking about the material effects of technology on everyday people. And Lina, as FTC chair, you were doing a lot of work that was oriented around protecting consumers, protecting small businesses, protecting people who are, on the blunt end of these tech products effects. And one thing that I really appreciate is that you didn't just do that work from Washington, D.C., but you went out and you met people where they were. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that, and what it taught you about the ability of, law enforcement to be a tool in the toolkit for protecting people from these kinds of harms.
Yeah, I mean, I think, oftentimes we see, be it in AI or crypto or elsewhere, a tendency for arguments that say, this is so radically new, maybe we need new laws, but of course the old laws don't apply. And one thing that, when we were all there, we were really focused on was the fact that the existing laws do apply, right? And so existing laws banning things like collusion or price fixing or certain forms of discrimination, we kind of made very clear that there was no AI exemption from the laws on the books and wanted to make sure that the market had that on notice. I think one tendency in DC you can see sometimes is for policymakers to over-index on kind of commentary from elite pundits and others, which really informs their understanding of kind of what problems exist out in the world. I had a bit of an idiosyncratic path to the FTC, starting off initially as a journalist, and so was just more oriented towards wanting to make sure we were hearing just from regular people about how these issues of corporate power were affecting them in their day-to-day lives. And so be it on issues of tech, where we, met with founders, but also did, say, roundtables with creators from across medium, be it, artists and graphic designers to fashion models, to hear from them how these technologies were affecting them, and, heard from a huge swath of them about how even though they recognize that these technologies could lead to advancements and even advancements in their own art and professions, many of them had just woken up one day and found that their life's work had just been ingested by this model without any consent, without any compensation, and now they were facing a situation where they could be forced to compete with models that had been trained on their own work, and how they were just really aghast that there had been no kind of effort to govern at this from the get-go, and just what the cleanup would look like was going to be a big question mark. I do think that existing laws can play an important role here, and we are already seeing efforts, especially at the state level, to figure out, what can be done here. I would put some of those legal efforts in a few buckets. One is efforts to basically regulate and govern the use of these AI tools. And so we've seen a whole set of states pass laws that prohibit, for example, algorithmic price fixing of rents, since we've seen some major landlords basically be able to collude through all using the same price setting algorithm. So we've seen some progress there. We're seeing some states push back on this issue of surveillance pricing, the idea that people's personal data can be used to set person-specific pricing in ways that can really exploit information asymmetries. So I think that we are seeing some progress on the kind of governing of use cases. I think one thing that your book really highlights is just these first-order questions around, what are the resources that are even being allowed to be committed and diverted to this, and at what expense and what trade-offs. I think this is where a lot of the kind of agreements that states and municipalities enter into with these companies in terms of data centers or water rights, that's an area that I think we need a lot more scrutiny. Sometimes these companies argue that these agreements that are being entered into between a public government and a private company should stay private and confidential because of trade secrets. Which is, I think, a big area where we need some pushback too. So I think those are just some areas. I think there are also first-order questions about what is the right way to govern different layers of the stack here, be it the chips, be it the compute in the cloud, be it the models, be it the downstream uses. I think each of these has different economic properties, and each of them is fairly consolidated in terms of their level of control right now. But I think what alternative frameworks could look like will kind of vary depending on the layer.
So we're going to get to questions in just a minute, so start thinking of what you'd like to ask. But just to close out, I wanted to ask you both a little bit about your own craft. Because if there's anything that we need right now, it's more of this kind of work, especially given the opacity of the industry that we're dealing with. So I'd like to ask you both, of the many things that you could be spending your day doing, how is it that you go about identifying, like, these are the questions that really need answering, and then how do you go about answering them? And maybe we can start with you, Lina.
I mean, I think focusing on what are the areas that seem really complex and opaque, because I think we've seen time and time again how that opacity and complexity can be used to shroud power and what power is doing. I think time and time again of the financial crisis and how there was so much opacity around these financial instruments that ended up blowing up the economy, and just kind of expanding the number of people that are really studying and scrutinizing some of these opaque markets. I'm a big believer in regularly reading the business press, like the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, that actually do a really good job of kind of describing the nuts and bolts of how different markets work. And that can also be a way to kind of spot where are some of the areas of opacity that we see that we need more kind of public attention to as well.
For me, my theory of change for why I became a journalist is that I really do believe that if you can inform people and enable a larger collective to all be asking questions and critiquing a system, that is ultimately where we can have, the democratic process work the best, where everyone is thinking about how they can contribute, what they want to contest, how they want to challenge. And so I'm always thinking about, how do I write stories that reveal the system so that people know what levers they can latch onto within the system, but also how do we ultimately build empathy and help people understand how that system affects the individual? Because if you always stay at the abstract level, then you don't really realize how, like, intersecting harms can actually affect one person going through all of them. And so usually when I'm choosing a story, I'm thinking about what are the aspects of a particular system that are just not well understood. And when I started the book, I was thinking, like, people don't really know digital technologies have supply chains, and I really want to show that there is a supply chain in the first place, and through that, hopefully people will then learn how they interface with the supply chain, and to Lina's point, then can actually use all of these different ingredients in the supply chain or sites of deployment for AI to democratically contest the technology and help evolve it to a better place. And then I chose, like, who are the characters that I really want. Like, I want people to step into the shoes of someone who they have never met before and see the system through their eyes. Like, what is it that they can learn from this person's experience that would have never crossed their mind, and what can then motivate them to actually start grappling more with their role in their active role in shaping this otherwise obscure and otherwise seemingly abstract technology.
Thank you both. We're going to now open up the mics for a Q&A. We have a couple of roaming microphones. I'm going to stand up here, and Amma, do you want to join me? All right, we see a few questions around. All right, why don't you start?
Hi,
Sure.
Tim.
Hi, nice to see you guys. Hi, Karen and Lina. I have a question for Karen, and Lina, I can ask a question anytime. But Karen, congratulations on the book, and I really enjoyed it, as I said. I'm Tim Wu from Columbia, also Lina's colleague. So here's what I think is a really challenging question that I want to see what you think about. I take your setup of the empire, and that we're missing many of the main problems in this sort of good emperor, bad empire sort of dynamic. At times when I was reading your book, it almost reminded me of medieval. Your book, the empire thing is more 19th century, but medieval Europe, where you'd have these crazy wars over the nature of God, and people, whether God is one person, two, all these kind of things, and these enormous. And of course, people are very serious. I mean, if you go back, people really felt very strongly about this question. It wasn't a joke for them whether God was one person, two people, or three, or all combined, or whatever. But the people who were affected were the people involved in the wars and so on and so forth. So I thought that was a very powerful idea. And part of what I think your book does really well is deliver the sense that this battle between the doomers and the boomers is really abstracted away from harm that people may be feeling in other countries. And I appreciate the reporting, or even here in some of the stuff that Lina has done with fraud and just human impersonation, like sort of real harms that are a little more visceral. But the question I'm asking, if we're not just trying to get people to be on the side of the, I guess, doomers and be like, regulate because I think that in Washington in particular, it took the side of, well, the progressive thing to do is to worry about the destruction of the world. So we need to pass like licensing legislation. I think a lot of people decided that must be the progressive thing. The question is, what is the progressive line in this area? And I know it's not an easy question. I have my own thoughts on it, but I'm curious if it's not like good empire against bad empire. Do we have some vision of what it is?
Democracy. Yeah, that's a great question. What you mentioned is that the boomers and doomers are abstracted from real harms. And so one of the things that I concluded in my reporting is that you cannot, both the boomers and doomers share equal responsibility in the massive acceleration of this technology and the scaling of the harms. So because their rhetoric is so detached from how people actually interface with this technology and interface with the supply chain of this technology, they actually do the exact opposite of what they believe that they're doing, even in the doomer camp. They believe that they're somehow preventing catastrophe, and they're actually accelerating catastrophe, just a different version of what they imagine to be catastrophe. And so I think the thing that I really advocate for is like real world accountability of these companies and documenting how they actually operate, what are the harms that they actually engage in, who gets harmed, who profits from that harm, and then figuring out how to mitigate those real world harms and then check these companies' power. I think that is the most progressive thing to do. And ultimately, as I said in the beginning of my answer, that I think that is the best way to fortify democracy.
Okay, I think we're going to take a couple of questions for the next round. So Ali, you had your hand up. Let's take these two and then.
Thanks so much for this great conversation. You all referred to this a bit, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the physical infrastructure of AI, such as data centers, and how you see that as part of this empire frame, and how maybe taking on the data center industry and expansion of this physical infrastructure can be a strategic tool for reining in the industry.
Great. And then.
Is it my turn to ask the question now? Hi, I'm Kathy. We graduated from MIT a decade ago. In fact, I went to a reunion this past weekend.
Hi,
I'm
Kathy.
glad I made it to your talk today. It's really interesting to me. Well, first of all, I'm really proud of you studying at MIT together in mechanical engineering, and now you're talking about supply chains in a different context. Nice one on that. I think, the world could use more of people like us, because MIT not only taught us how, the mind and hand, but mind and heart. And it's really important that we stay empathetic to what's going on around us. The point I want to make is that so MIT, many of our graduates, as you know, went to Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. A lot of us are probably working on that same technology. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, most of us are probably male working on that technology. Now, even then, I believe that having this degree from the most prominent engineering university does not prevent us or shield us from layoffs. In fact, a couple of our classmates I even met are not having jobs at the moment. And so many of it is impacted by AI. Now, how do we then benefit from AI? How can we get AI to actually promote and give us more job opportunities? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, those
so
are two really meaty.
Data centers.
Those are two really meaty questions. Okay, so on the data center point, It's a great question. So the sheer rate of expansion of data centers that's happening right now is really, really under-examined. There was a report from McKinsey just recently that said that in order to keep up with the current pace of data center expansion, in the next 5 years, we would need to add as much energy onto the global grid as what is consumed by 2 to 6 times the entire energy consumption of California. Most of that is coming from fossil fuels because we do not have renewable. These data centers have to run 24/7. Renewable energy doesn't do that. We don't have enough nuclear fission capacity, and let alone we definitely do not have nuclear fusion, even though Sam Altman likes to pretend that's coming right around the corner. And so this is absolutely a huge, huge environmental, public health, climate harm, many intersecting harms. And it is also, as I think Ali mentioned, a huge lever that people can grab onto. Like, so many data centers are being developed in so many communities around the world right now. That means most people in the world are actually living near a data center and could go to city council meetings to actually talk to their city about whether or not they want a data center. And there are actually communities all around the world, in the US, in Chile, in Uruguay, as I document in the book, in Spain, in France, in Sweden, that are all starting to do that and actually pushing back against the data center development and saying, unless you actually give us a reason for why we should accept this infrastructure development, whether it's the creation of long-term sustainable beneficial jobs, or it's limiting the freshwater resources, limiting the energy that these data centers consume, we will not actually accept it into our community. And that in and of itself is containing the pace at which it could, if we continue to fortify these movements, it could actually contain the pace at which these data centers expand and then be one lever of many by which we slow down the rate of AI development and actually introduce more democratic contestation throughout it. On the point of how we could actually develop AI to bring more jobs, I mean, this is one of the things that I cite in the book, this book called Power and Progress by two MIT professors, Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, who just won the Nobel Prize in Economics last year. And they make this argument in their book that all technology revolutions have, they're not inevitable, but they all have taken a similar shape throughout the last 1,000 years of history, which is, in order to build transformative technologies, there needs to be a lot of capital and there needs to be a concentration of talent. And so usually the people who wields that capital and can rally that talent are the people at the top of society who have very narrow conceptions of how society works and, in their privilege, then design technology in their image, and that ultimately leads to automation of jobs or exploitation of labor rather than the creation of it. But one of the things that they argue is that in the AI revolution could be different. We could actually make different choices where, instead of developing so-called AGI, which is explicitly defined as a labor automating technology, we could be developing assistive AI tools that are explicitly designed to support the expertise and skills and strengths of humans rather than replace them. And so ultimately, I think the way to actually get AI to create more jobs is by applying pressure to the companies that are developing it as an automation technology to ultimately bring it, make it a more assistive one.
Okay, we have 5 minutes. Questions, not comments. Someone from the middle. No, that wasn't a jab at anyone, just a general reminder that we're doing questions, not comments. Maybe in the... So maybe we can chat about it over drink reception, because there's a bunch of questions. Maybe over there, and yeah.
Oh, okay, me first. Hi, thank you for your comments, and I'm looking forward to diving into the book. But a Meteor Network just published some comments on how philanthropy could influence or kind of like shift some of the trajectories that are happening right now in, big tech and all of these, and disrupt maybe some of these monopolies. And as you mentioned, just like money and power and research, wondering if you have any comment on how philanthropy can disrupt some of these monopolies.
Let's take one more question, and then you can answer them together.
Hi, thank you so much to all three of you for the panel discussion. I'm Damini, I'm from Amnesty International over here. And, you know, I and many of us working in this field, I think are currently reckoning with a piece of empire which came out very strongly in what you all spoke to in the panel discussion, which is the narrative power. Mm-hmm. And I think you started with that as well. And that, you know, whether it's the arms race, the mythologizing, I mean, there were so many examples when you all were speaking about that kind of power that we're really up against. And so a big question for us working in the field is how do we build a counter narrative? And secondly, how do we get people to mobilize around that counter narrative? And Karen, you've spoken a lot about informing people being, you know, a big step in that, and this book being a huge step in that. But I'm wondering what does the mobilization piece look like after that? And I think that also speaks to the empire framing, in that is sort of what it has taken historically to fracture empire, to topple empire, if that's even something we can imagine in this case. So yeah, what does it take to build a counter narrative and to actually mobilize people around it?
Okay, two very complimentary questions.
Good.
Okay, Karen.
I mean, I think your question about, the role of philanthropy is interesting. Obviously, one of the areas of monopolization that we see is over the research and the kind of knowledge trajectories. And so providing other forms of support for that, I think is going to be really important. Historically, the government has played such a critical role. All of that is kind of a big question mark right now. So I think, a lot could be done through philanthropy too.
Yeah, kind of building on Lina's answer, one of the things that I talk about in my epilogue is this idea that ultimately, in order to redistribute the power that empires have, we need to think about all of their monopolies and controlling influence on different spheres, including the narrative one. And going back to what I said in the beginning, that empires have a monopoly on knowledge production. We need just more knowledge production that's both scientific knowledge production and journalistic knowledge production. So I think both your questions really tie nicely together. Philanthropy can fund more of that, both more journalists that are telling the real stories of how this technology is interfacing with society and what these companies are actually doing in the world, so that we start moving away from that frame of the boomers and the doomers in the theoretical space, and also should be funding more scientific research that is independent of these companies, so that we can actually understand scientifically how these technologies work and what their limitations are. And I think if we have more centers of knowledge production outside of the empire, that is when we can have a real chance at developing counter narratives that aren't just counter narratives for resisting narratives, but are like real grounded narratives for what is actually happening.
Thank you. Everyone, let's give Karen and Lina another round of applause.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all for the energy that you've brought to this evening. I'm going to do a very quick vote of thanks, and then we can move to the drinks reception. So a big shout out to Gail Brussel at Penguin Press, Andrew Owen at Postman Books for setting up the book selling booth outside, and Ryan Wild and his team at the Green Space for this wonderful venue. Special thanks to our AI Now team, Ali Finn, Kate Brennan, and especially Ellen Schwartz, who worked really tirelessly to ensure this event's success. So now please join us outside for a glass of wine. Definitely buy a book while you're at it, and Karen will be outside for signing them.
And thank you
so
also to Amba, Sarah, and Lina for being here and making all of this happen. It's been wonderful to be in conversation with all of you.